Sensitive to anything? Join the club. A growing number of us are developing sensitivities to things like lactose, peanuts, gluten, casein, soy, fragrance, histamine, dyes, and we're discovering it's possible to develop intolerances to all sorts of things that might not affect others. But who would have thought that anyone could react to something that's invisible, odorless, subperceptual in every way, something that isn't even matter? That's why we're going to talk about the modern world's newest and most controversial sensitivity, electromagnetic hypersensitivity, known as EHS. EHS is just what it sounds like, a physical reaction to various frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum. Weird, right? But it's affecting more people by the year. In fact, lead researcher Dr. Magda Havas estimates that about 3% of the population may be severely affected by this, and more than a third of us still experience some degree of sensitivity, with women being overwhelmingly afflicted. EHS is classified as an idiopathic environmental illness, just like multiple chemical sensitivity, but it also shares some etiological features and treatment plans with other poorly understood conditions, like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, as they are all believed to involve some degree of autonomic nervous system dysfunction. The reason I say EHS is controversial is because for some reason there's a really heated debate about whether it even exists, or if these hysterical people should seek mental health treatment. But let's back up. First, we'll have a brief refresher on what electromagnetic fields are. Then we'll cover the symptoms of EHS, some of the known biological effects of wireless radiation, why some of us are more likely to be affected than others, and why it's so critical we start to publicly acknowledge this serious impairment. To get how this all works, you need to know a tiny bit about electromagnetic radiation, which I'll refer to as EMR or EMS for electromagnetic fields. Simply put, the EM spectrum consists of ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, which is divided in the middle by visible light, the small slice we can actually see. Ionizing radiation is made up of teeny tiny high-energy waves like UV, X-rays, and gamma rays, and is characterized by its ability to remove electrons from atoms, ionizing them, hence the name. And we know those are bad for us. Instead, we're going to focus on the other side of the spectrum, non-ionizing radiation. This is a broad range of signals used by radio and microwaves, and up until the 20th century, humans had virtually zero contact with EMR outside of Earth's magnetic field and the star that's 93 million miles away. But now their prevalence is exploding at an exponential rate. So what are the primary sources? Well, first of all, every electrical device generates electric and magnetic fields, but on top of that, we're now broadcasting EMFs from cell and radio towers, Wi-Fi routers, Bluetooth devices, your phone, watch, earbuds, security system, tablets, appliances, laptops. You get the idea. And these smart devices communicate and are constantly sending and receiving data via little pulses that actually aren't so little, especially when we're stacking device on top of device. And just like all the other times that eager entrepreneurs have introduced their stuff to the market without proper safety testing, as a result, a growing number of people's worlds have been utterly rocked. So what are the signs and symptoms of EHS? First of all, since you probably won't go into anaphylactic shock from a phone call, it can be hard to trace EMF symptoms to the source, but that doesn't make them any less real. So obviously, EHS requires some exposure to EMR, whether that be in the form of just using a cell or cordless phone or any of the other things we just discussed. The sky's the limit. And the problem is these symptoms are pernicious, meaning they often begin mildly, inconsistently, or they can manifest as other conditions altogether just due to the way they affect some of our most basic cellular processes. But once this happens, you might start to notice more headaches, unexplained insomnia, fatigue, pains, trouble concentrating, memory lapses or brain farts, rashes, anxiety, heart palpitations, or even frightening episodes of a racing heartbeat. Your thought patterns, mood, personality might even subtly change. You might even keep gaslighting yourself that it's all in your head, but intuitively, you'll know something's not right. Now, these symptoms are more likely to follow a period of either intense exposure or impaired immune function. Like, you might get a headache after a long phone call, but it can be delayed or seem spontaneous just due to our constant bombardment of wireless radiation. Exposure and immune function are also hard to quantify. But how can you tell EMFs are to blame? It's pretty simple. Remove yourself from all devices as best you can for about a week, 3 days bare minimum, and see how you feel. You'll probably notice the difference with even just a reduction. And if that sounds like evidence for a nocebo effect, keep in mind that's just how we discover intolerances. It's an elimination diet for your cells. So how can non-ionizing radiation, waves we're told that have been perfectly safe, even cause this? Well, what the tech companies with the powerful lobbies don't want you to know is that non-thermal pulse signals have been found in literally thousands of peer-reviewed studies to be biologically active, which means your cells feel them even if you can't. So for starters, EMR is a potent source of oxidative stress. In fact, rats exposed to microwave radiation were found to have a dose-dependent relationship increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines and produce less of our most powerful antioxidant glutathione. Now, this inflammation is necessary for infections and healing of wounds, but when something continually aggravates that, you set yourself up for chronic inflammatory or autoimmune conditions, DNA damage, cancer, dementia, heart disease, a lot of bad stuff. We don't have time to cover all the health effects here, but just as a few examples, a longitudinal study from Switzerland found a relationship between dementia and living near power lines, which radiate strong magnetic fields. There's another study on radio broadcasters. Here, Von Glove and others found a staggering rate of hypertension among radio and television operators compared to controls. The exposure was linked to a, quote, increase in the excretion rates of cortisol, adrenaline, and noradrenaline, all chemicals your body produces as part of the stress response. To piggyback on that, Dr. Magda Havas found EMFs to affect both the heart and nervous system. She reports that not only can EMFs cause your red blood cells to clump together, but in a double-blind experiment by Havas and others, in both real and sham environments, the heart rate of participants was measured before and after using a cordless phone. Some of the participants experienced tachycardia or arrhythmia, as well as an upregulated sympathetic nervous system response. Another study found that rats exposed to Wi-Fi signals for 1 hour per day for 28 days displayed similar anxiety-like symptoms. Part of the reason for these and other neurological symptoms is due to the way EMFs interfere with the voltage-gated calcium channels of our neurons, which causes all sorts of downstream effects, like interference with neuronal signaling, especially to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and can send your brain into fight or flight mode, activating the sympathetic nervous system response. All this can trigger anxiety, restlessness, depression. As a matter of fact, some EHS-savvy doctors actually recommend calcium channel blockers. But anyway, what's scary is that the more your sympathetic nervous system becomes activated, the harder it is to shut off, like in the cases of those with PTSD. So, technically, EMF sensitivity can be in your head. While it's important to understand that EMR is simply not good for us, there's plenty of biomarkers for those of us who have become sensitive. In fact, you can easily find diagnostic materials from other countries such as Canada, Austria, and Sweden, who draw from their own independent research as well as that of Dr. Balpam and others. Speaking of whom, Dr. Balpam actually classifies the brains of those with EHS as being in a pre-Alzheimer's state due to the reduced blood flow to certain areas of the limbic system. He also found this leads to neuroinflammation as an extension of that reduced blood flow, blood histamine levels that were 2 to 10 times higher than in healthy controls, which are directly tied to inflammation as well, a leaky blood-brain barrier, higher levels of autoantibodies against myelin and the loss of the myelin sheath, which is necessary for every neural impulse in your brain, as well as decreased melatonin production. So there are quantifiable differences between healthy individuals and those with this condition. But if EMFs are so bad, why isn't all this horrible stuff happening to all of us? Well, for starters, unless you're in the best condition of your life, how do you know any of your health complaints aren't partially caused by EMFs? You don't have the control group of yourself. But as far as obvious sensitivities go, there are definitely predisposing factors. Like most other conditions, EHS follows the stress diathesis model, where the individual often has some form of predisposition that, when combined with a stressor, like elevated levels of wireless radiation, creates the perfect storm for illness. So what are those factors? In no particular order: 1, certain genetic markers that can predict detoxification abilities, the aptly named MTHFR mutation being one among many. 2, illnesses or viruses, like retroviruses of the herpes family, especially Epstein-Barr, and more recently, anecdotally, COVID infection and/or the vaccine and Lyme disease. 3, occupations that expose you to high levels of EMFs, like electricians, for example. 4, toxic mold or heavy metal exposure, or even improper removal methods that only redistribute metals around the body. 5, all sorts of comorbid conditions like mast cell activation, histamine intolerance, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, to name a few, and of course other sensitivities, especially multiple chemical sensitivity. And 6, psychiatric conditions, especially if you have an overactive nervous system. Wireless radiation virtually dumps gasoline on that fire. Granted, the last one is a little tough because it's a bit of a chicken versus the egg situation. Did the anxiety precede the sensitivity, or did the damage from EMFs cause the anxiety? But if I had $1 for every time someone told me that EHS was a mental illness, I could fund my own research team. And to address the rebuttals I've seen, yes, there are actually studies that demonstrate those with self-reported sensitivities react to nothing at all. And there's a reason for this. Due to the way exposure to certain toxins activates the trauma centers of our brains, it actually changes the way our fight or flight response perceives a threat. It all goes back to that limbic system I just mentioned. So in other words, after being traumatized by severe EMF exposure, even a perceived exposure can evoke some of the same physical symptoms as a real one, though I would hypothesize this would only be observed during acute, not chronic conditions. Unfortunately, there aren't any studies for that. And in these cases, it doesn't mean the person's sensitivity is fabricated, it just means they need both physical and mental rehabilitation. So why is it so important to spread awareness about this rare condition? For starters, all these predisposing factors and the overall toxic burden of our environment, compounded with the exploding rate of wireless tech, means those of us with EHS are growing fast. And unless you live with the Amish, you don't know whether you'll be affected. And when this happens, living a normal life in the modern world will become impossible for you. It's more than just not using a smartphone that often. Depending on the severity, some of us are forced to move, with no guarantee the new location will be safe. You'll possibly have to end your career, never travel, forego important medical imaging tests like MRIs and X-rays, and just completely surrender your entire lifestyles because EMFs are becoming that increasingly inescapable. For instance, since all those Wi-Fi access points have been installed in every office and classroom, I cannot work in an office. I will not be able to complete my graduate education on any campus. I will not visit stores and restaurants that are directly beside 5G or cell towers. Dental X-rays give me tinnitus for weeks, and I can't sit any closer than this to my laptop. And I'm far less sensitive than other people, some of whom live totally off the grid. See, the more normalized wireless tech becomes, the less normal our lives will have to be. It's one thing to use Wi-Fi in your own home, but tech companies have zero limitations on how far and wide they can expand their public infrastructure. This is because the FCC has pathetic 25-year-old regulations, and more recently, laws were fast-tracked in every state to prevent individual cities from rejecting 5G. And the reason 5G gets its infamy is because it just blankets us in close-range microwaves. You just can't get away from it. So imagine you had asthma, lived in a city with severe air pollution. Oh, and everyone smokes inside, and you have no inhaler. That's what it's like being in a city with EHS. But the difference is, we have no rights or protections. Despite the fact that EHS has been recognized by the World Health Organization since 2005, somehow the nation with the best healthcare in the world simply shrugs its shoulders and refers us to psychiatric care. No official diagnosis, no ADA accommodations for us, no necessary treatment plans to, God forbid, actually recover, and no guarantee even our own homes will be safe. If this involved anything other than up-and-coming technology, this would be a grievous offense. This is why we, anyone who cares for their own health, especially that of their children, or just fellow human in general, needs to get involved and spread the message. We must appeal the FCC for stricter regulations, contact our local officials and representatives, because we all deserve to live without compromising our health and safety. But if we don't do anything, tech companies will continue installing towers, and eventually, you could very well become part of that 35%. Maybe even the 3%, and you may not have anywhere left to go. Again, I'm not asking anyone to give up their gadgets. I love technology, but unless someone wants to time travel and bring back long-term data on this, we're flying blindly with this stuff. And tech companies must act more responsibly before installing cell towers 20 feet from homes, schools, and businesses, or be held responsible for their damages. And the American Medical Association needs to recognize EHS, so I and others like me can be protected with the same rights as someone else with any other disability. And we need to strip the stigma from EHS. I could not tell you how much vitriol I've gotten for even mentioning it. And I need you to please share this message so we can all start learning responsible technology practices ourselves. Because trust me, you don't want this. EHS sucks, and it could have easily been prevented.
No amount of evidence will ever persuade an idiot. No amount of evidence, it seems. No amount of showing you 100 or 1,000 proofs will ever get your blinded eyes to see. Oh, no amount of evidence will ever persuade an idiot.